My brothers stole my family's farm. They didn't know I was preparing a trap for them. My name's Daniel Miller, and this is probably the most messed up inheritance story you'll ever hear. You know how they say blood is thicker than water? Well, turns out ink on paper is thicker than both. My grandfather, everyone called him Old Flint, used to tell me something that stuck with me through everything that happened. He'd grab a handful of our Nebraska soil, let it run through his weathered fingers, and say that land isn't dirt, it's memory. Memory of every seed planted, every prayer whispered during drought years, every celebration after harvest. That memory lived in our fields, sure, but it also lived in my father's study in our 1890s farmhouse. The heart of that room was this massive oak desk my great-grandfather built with his own hands back when Teddy Roosevelt was still president. That desk witnessed 3 generations of handshake deals, loan signatures, and harvest calculations. It's also where I last saw my father live, going over next season's planning schedule just 2 days before his heart gave out. The funeral was what you'd expect in rural Nebraska. Half the county showed up. Casseroles everywhere. People telling stories about how my dad helped them through tough times. But what happened at the wake? That's where this whole nightmare started. My cousins Mark and Steve pulled me aside into Dad's study. These guys hadn't set foot on the farm in maybe 5 years. But here they were in their $1,000 Denver suits, looking like Wall Street crashed a barn raising. They seemed so out of place next to Dad's collection of cracked leather farming journals and that faded John Deere calendar still showing March when we were already in September. Mark set a stack of papers on that oak desk, right where Dad used to keep his morning coffee. He started talking in this voice like he was selling me a timeshare in Florida. Said they knew I was devastated. That grief makes it hard to think straight. Then came the pitch. Inheritance taxes would eat me alive. Potential creditors could come after the state. The whole 9 yards of legal scaremongering. They'd already talked to their lawyers. They said, best way to protect the family farm was to form an LLC. The company would own the land, shield it from any claims. We'd all be partners. They'd even front the legal fees and setup costs. No questions asked. I should have seen it coming. I really should have. But standing there in that room that still smelled like Dad's Old Spice and pipe tobacco, with his work boots still muddy by the door, I couldn't think straight. They kept saying it was just paperwork, a formality to protect what 3 generations had built. Mark pushed the pen across the desk, the same desk where my grandmother taught me to write my name, where Dad showed me how to calculate bushels per acre. I signed. God help me, I signed every page they put in front of me. The next 6 months were a blur of trying to keep the farm running while dealing with grief. I threw myself into work, fixed fences, repaired the old John Deere that Dad never got around to finishing. Anything to not think about that empty chair at dinner. The cousins, they vanished back to Denver the day after the funeral. Didn't even stick around to help with the harvest. Then came the letter that changed everything. Annual property tax assessment from Miller Family Holdings, LLC. I figure it was just a new company name. No big deal. But there at the bottom, in black and white, was the ownership breakdown. My name, 25%. Mark, 37.5%. Steve, 37.5%. I read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The numbers didn't change. My hands were shaking when I called Mark. First ring, no answer. Second try, he picked up. I could hear restaurant noise in the background, probably some fancy steakhouse. I asked him about the ownership percentages, trying to keep my voice level. There had to be a mistake. The laugh that came through that phone was something I'll never forget. Cold, amused, like a cat that cornered a mouse. Mark explained it to me like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. Said the percentages reflected capital contribution and management responsibilities. Since they were taking on the financial risk and making the big decisions, they needed controlling interest. I was just the operations manager, the boots on the ground. When I started yelling that they'd tricked me, that they'd used my father's death to steal my land, Steve must have been listening on speaker, because his voice cut in. Steve's words hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken. He said I should be grateful. Said without their sophisticated planning, I'd lose everything within a year to taxes and debt. 25% of something beats 100% of nothing, he said. Then he welcomed me to the real world and suggested I get back to work. After all, I had minority shareholders to answer to now. They hung up while I was still shouting. I tried fighting back, took out loans against the equipment to pay for a lawyer, but the contracts were airtight. They'd been planning this for who knows how long. Probably had the paperwork ready before Dad's body was cold. The lawyer, some overworked public defender type, basically told me I was screwed. Possession is 9/10 of the law, but signatures are the other 90%. That year, everything that could go wrong did. Drought hit hard. You know those disaster movies where the earth cracks and nothing grows? That was my reality. The corn stalked up maybe 3 feet, then just gave up, brown and worthless. Soybeans never even had a chance. I watched my family's legacy wither under a sun that felt personal in its cruelty. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd lost most of the farm on paper, and now I was losing the rest of nature. Then came the call that felt like the final nail in the coffin. Steve again, but this time no pretense of family concern. His voice was all business, like he was discussing a portfolio adjustment instead of my life. He said their investment wasn't performing, so they had an offer from AgriCorp. You know, one of those massive agricultural conglomerates that's been swallowing family farms since forever. They wanted to sell. As majority owners, they could force the sale through the courts, but they were giving me the courtesy of 2 weeks to accept the inevitable. The number he offered for my 25% wouldn't even cover my debts. I asked what happened to protecting the family legacy. He actually laughed and said the only legacy that matters is the one you can deposit in a bank. After he hung up, I stood in the middle of that dried-up cornfield. The stalks rustled in the wind like whispers from 3 generations of millers who'd worked this land. My great-grandfather who broke this soil with horses and pure determination. My grandfather who survived the Dust Bowl here. My father who modernized everything but never forgot where he came from. You want to know something funny? Standing there in that dead field, I didn't feel defeated. I felt something else entirely. Rage, maybe, or something older and more patient than rage. My grandfather used to say that farmers are gamblers who bet against God and sometimes win. Well, my cousins had just made their bet. They thought they were playing poker while I was playing checkers. They had no idea I was about to flip the whole damn board. 2 weeks, Steve had said. 2 weeks to save everything or lose it all. I walked back to the house, past that oak desk visible through the study window, and for the first time since Dad died, I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a kind of smile Old Flint probably had right before he decided to stay and fight through the Dust Bowl when everyone else fled to California. My cousins thought they'd won. They thought a farm boy with dirt under his nails couldn't possibly fight back against their city lawyers and LLC paperwork. They measured everything in dollars and percentages. But they forgot one crucial thing that every farmer knows deep in their bones. The land always keeps score and it always collects its debts. This wasn't just about the farm anymore. This was about family, betrayal, and the kind of justice you can't find in any courthouse. My cousins had made one critical error in their perfect plan. They assumed I was just another country fool who'd roll over and accept his fate. They were about to learn what Old Flint taught me. When someone tries to steal your land, you don't just fight back. You make sure they never forget why that was a mistake. This was war, and in war, you use every weapon you've got, even the ones nobody knows you have. After that phone call with Steve, after his 2-week ultimatum, I couldn't stay in the house. Every room felt like it was closing in. The walls held too many memories of better times. Dad's laughter, Mom's Sunday dinners before she passed, birthdays when my cousins actually pretended to care about family. So I walked. When you got 800 acres and nowhere else to go, you walk. I ended up at the ravine on the eastern edge of our property. Locals called it Miller's Gulch, though nobody remembered why. It was the one spot on our entire farm where nothing ever grew. Not corn, not soybeans, not even those stubborn prairie grasses that could survive nuclear winter. Just rocks, clay, and disappointment. A creek used to run through it. Had been running since before Nebraska was even a state. Every summer of my childhood, I'd catch crawdads there while Old Flint supervised in the shade, spinning stories about the old days. But now, bone dry. The drought had killed it just like everything else. I sat on a boulder that had probably been there since the glaciers retreated. The sun was setting, painting everything the color of dried blood. Felt appropriate. Everything I touched turned to dust anyway. The farm, the legacy, probably my sanity next. I picked up a rock to throw, just to hear something break. When a memory hit me so hard, I nearly fell off that boulder. I was maybe 10 years old, right here in this exact spot. Old Flint had brought me down after a particularly bad hailstorm destroyed our wheat. I was crying because I thought we'd lose the farm. Kid logic, you know? But grandfather just sat there, calm as a Sunday morning, smoking his pipe and looking at the dry creek bed. The water had been low that year, too. He told me something that sounded like nonsense at the time. Said most folks spend their whole lives looking up at the sky for miracles, praying for rain, watching for signs, waiting for God to drop answers in their lap. He called them fools, but not in a mean way, more like he felt sorry for them. Then he grabbed my shoulder with those hands that felt like leather gloves made of tree bark and pointed down at the ground. The real treasures, he said, are always under your feet. Always. But here's the trick. You can only see them when the world stops giving you what you expect. When the river runs dry, that's when you look for sky in the earth. I thought he'd been drinking. Old Flint had a reputation for his moonshine recipes, after all. But he was stone sober, looking at me with those gray eyes that had seen dust bowls and depressions and worse. He said it again, made me repeat it back like it was a pledge of allegiance. When the river runs dry, Danny, look for sky in the earth. 23 years later, sitting in that same gulch with my life in ruins, those words came back like a slap from a ghost. I looked down at the creek bed, really looked, for the first time in my life. The sunset light was hitting the rocks at just the right angle, and that's when I saw it. One stone didn't look like the others. While everything else was Nebraska brown or gray, the colors of earth that's given up, this one seemed to hold the last light of day inside it. Dark blue, almost black, but with something alive in its depth, like someone had chipped off a piece of midnight from a clear winter sky and left it here for safekeeping. I picked it up. Heavy, way heavier than it should have been for its size. When I turned in the dying light, it seemed to glow from within, blue fire trapped in stone. My heart started hammering. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. I came back that night with a flashlight, then the next night, and the next. Each time I found more. Not many. Maybe a dozen total over the course of a week. All in the dry creek bed. All that impossible blue. All heavy like they were made of condensed midnight. I kept them in an old coffee can in the barn, hidden behind boxes of Dad's tax returns that nobody would ever want to look through. Here's the thing about small towns. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone's daddy knew everyone's granddaddy. That's how I knew Harold Peterson, the only geologist in 3 counties. He was 87, mean as a snake, and had been friends with Old Flint since before color TV was invented. More importantly, he knew how to keep his mouth shut. I drove to his place at dawn, that coffee can sitting on my passenger seat, like a live grenade. Harold was already up, sitting on his porch with coffee that could strip paint. He took one look at my face and knew something was up. We went into his workshop. Really just a converted chicken coop full of rocks and microscopes and books, so old they might have been written by Moses. When I opened that coffee can and poured those stones onto his workbench, Harold dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the concrete floor, but neither of us moved to clean it up. He picked up one stone with hands that shook slightly. Not from age, from recognition. He put it under his microscope, then pulled out some chemical bottles. Did tests I didn't understand. The whole time, he was muttering under his breath. Sounded like cursing and praying had a baby. Finally, after what felt like 3 years, he looked up at me. His face was pale as winter wheat. He said Old Flint had been looking for these his whole life. Said my grandfather had a theory that glaciers had carried something special down from Canada millions of years ago, dropped it right here when they melted. Harold hadn't believed him. Nobody had. Then he said the words that changed everything. Cashmere sapphires. The rarest most valuable sapphires on Earth. The kind they hadn't found new deposits of in over 100 years. The kind that collectors would commit federal crimes to own. He weighed them, did more tests, kept shaking his head like he was trying to wake up from a dream. Conservative estimate? The dozen stones I'd found were worth maybe $4 million. Maybe more if sold to the right buyers. My legs went weak. I had to sit down on a crate of old National Geographics. But Harold wasn't celebrating. His face had gone from shocked to scared. He'd spent 30 years doing geological surveys for mining companies before retiring. He'd seen what happened when word got out about finds like this. Big corporations would descend like locusts. Lawyers, claim jumpers, government agencies suddenly interested in mineral rights. They'd tie everything up in court for decades, bleed you dry with legal fees, maybe even arrange some convenient accidents. He'd seen it happen in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. Good people destroyed by their own good fortune. Then he told me about a man. No name, just a description and a phone number that Harold wrote on a piece of paper and immediately burned after I memorized it. This man, Harold said, was a ghost in the gemstone world. He paid cash, asked no questions, and knew how to make stones disappear into private collections where they'd never surface again. Harold had only met him once years ago, but the man had made an impression, like shaking hands with a well-dressed shark. Harold suggested I sell just one stone, the biggest one. It would give me enough to fight my cousins, maybe even win. But more importantly, it would keep the rest secret. He looked me dead in the eye and said something I'll never forget. This isn't lottery money, Danny. This is ammunition. Use it wrong, and it'll blow up in your face. Use it right, and you might just save your farm. The call was short. The ghost man had a voice like whiskey and cigarettes. I told him what I had. He asked 3 questions about the stone's characteristics that told me he knew exactly what he was doing. Then he named a place and time. A motel off Interstate 80, middle of nowhere, 2 a.m. Come alone. Bring the stone. He'd bring cash. The drive was the longest 3 hours of my life. Every truck looked like it was following me. Every rest stop felt like an ambush. I had Dad's revolver under my seat, though what good it would do against whatever I was imagining, I had no idea. The sapphire was in a sock in my jacket pocket. For $1 million in a tube sock from Walmart. The absurdity almost made me laugh, but it came out more like a sob. The motel was the kind of place where people went to have affairs, or buy things they shouldn't. Neon sign, missing half its letters. Parking lot full of shadows and bad decisions. Room 237, he'd said. When I knocked, using the pattern he'd specified, the door opened immediately. The man looked like an accountant. Gray suit, gray hair, gray eyes that gave away nothing. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't small talk. Just gestured to a table where a digital scale and jeweler's loop waited. I put the sapphire on the scale. He examined it for exactly 3 minutes, though it felt like 3 hours. Not a word. Just the hum of the ancient air conditioner and my heart trying to escape through my ribs. Finally, he reached into a briefcase and pulled out wrapped stacks of bills. Started counting them onto the table, like he was dealing cards. When he finished, there was $350,000 in neat piles. Less than Harold's estimate, but still more money than I'd ever seen. He pulled out a paper, a bill of sale for mineral specimens with no specifics. I signed it. He put the sapphire in a small velvet bag, then into a locked box, then into his briefcase. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes. As I was leaving, he spoke for only the second time. He said if I found more, don't call for at least a year. Then he added something that chilled me to the bone. He said to be careful who I trusted, that stones like these had a way of changing people, turning family into enemies. I almost laughed. Too late for that warning, buddy. I drove home as the sun came up, that money in a duffel bag in my trunk. Every cop I passed made me sweat. Every car that stayed behind me too long sent my paranoia into overdrive. But I made it. Parked in the barn, sat in Dad's old truck, and counted that money 5 times just to make sure it was real. $350,000. Not enough to buy back the farm at the price AgriCorp was offering. Not even close. But Harold had been right about one thing. This wasn't lottery money. This was ammunition. And now I had enough bullets to start a real war. I hid most of the cash in 3 different places around the farm. Banks would ask questions, file reports. Cash was invisible, untraceable, and ready for whatever came next. The remaining sapphires went into a new hiding spot, a place so personal, so tied to this family's history, that I wouldn't trust the paper, let alone tell another living soul. Some secrets are safer when they stay in the ground. Sitting in that barn, surrounded by 3 generations of farming equipment, I felt something I hadn't felt since Dad died. Not hope, exactly. That was too soft a word for it. This was harder, sharper, like iron heating up in a forge. My cousins thought they'd cornered a defeated man with no options. They were about to learn that a cornered animal with resources is the most dangerous kind. Old Flint had been right all along. The sky was in the earth, waiting for the river to run dry, waiting for someone desperate enough to look down instead of up. Those sapphires weren't just stones. They were weapons. And with 2 weeks on the clock, it was time to figure out how to start a war. With 2 weeks on the clock and $350,000 in cash in around the farm, I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I needed someone who played dirty and made it look clean. Someone who could take what my cousins did to me and flip it like a pancake on Sunday morning. James Henderson's office was on the 40th floor of the tallest building in Omaha, the kind of place where they validate your parking if you're worth their time and charge you $50 if you're not. His secretary looked at my dusty boots like I'd tracked manure across her Persian rug. But when I dropped Harold Peterson's name, the one reference Henderson had given the old geologist years ago, her whole demeanor changed. Suddenly I was, "Sir, would I like coffee? Mr. Henderson will see me immediately." Henderson himself looked like a shark in a $3,000 suit. Silver hair slicked back, eyes that could calculate your net worth in 3 seconds, hands that had probably shaken with devils and came away with their wallets. He listened to my story without interrupting, fingers steepled like he was praying to the god of billable hours. When I finished, he leaned back and actually laughed. Not a cruel laugh. More like a chess master who'd just been shown an interesting gambit. He said most people came to him to make schemes like my cousin's legal, to put a bow on theft and call it business. But to use his expertise to reverse engineer their own trap, that was art. That was the kind of challenge that made him remember why he went to law school before the money corrupted him. His exact words were that this would be like performing surgery with a sledgehammer. Crude, messy, but absolutely effective if done right. The price made me swallow hard. $100,000 up front, another $50,000 when it was done. But he guaranteed results or full refund, and in his 20-year career, he'd never issued a refund. I counted out the cash right there on his mahogany desk. He didn't even blink, just swept it into a drawer, like it was yesterday's newspaper. The plan he laid out was beautiful in its simplicity. We'd create a shell company, Big Sky Holdings, registered in Delaware where ownership could stay anonymous. Henderson would approach my cousins as the company's representative, not its owner. The offer would be irresistible, twice what AgriCorp was offering. Plans for a luxury development that would make them look like visionaries instead of vultures. Golf course, spa, the whole 9 yards of rich people nonsense. We'd stroke their egos until they purred. But here was the genius part. The contract would require all parties to sign in person together at the same location. Henderson said guys like my cousins got off on symbolic victories. They want to sign at the farm, probably in Dad's study, just to twist the knife one more time. They want to see my face when I sign away my pathetic 25%. They'd never suspect that their greed would make them walk right into their own trap. 2 days later, Henderson made the call. I sat in his office listening on speaker as he worked them like a virtuoso playing a violin. He introduced himself as representing an investment group from California, tech money looking for authentic Americana to develop. He threw around terms like sustainable luxury and agricultural heritage resort. I could practically hear my cousins salivating through the phone. Mark tried to play hardball at first, said they had other offers. Henderson laughed and said that was fine. His clients had other properties in mind, but he thought the Miller farm had special potential. Then he mentioned the number. $7 million for the whole package. The line went quiet for so long, I thought they'd hung up. Then Mark asked how soon they could meet. The beautiful part was how eager they were to include me in the humiliation. Steve actually insisted I be present for the signing, said it was important for family closure. Henderson played reluctant, said it might complicate things, but Steve pushed, said I was just a minority holder. My signature was needed, but I'd do whatever they told me. The contempt in his voice could have curdled milk. Henderson agreed, pretending it was a concession. The signing was set for the following Tuesday. At the farm, in Dad's study, at the same desk where they'd tricked me into signing everything away. The poetry of it was almost too perfect. Henderson would arrive as Big Sky Holdings representative. I'd be there as a defeated farmer boy, and my cousins would be there as what they really were, thieves about to steal from themselves. That Tuesday morning came gray and drizzling, like the sky was in on a joke. I stood in Dad's study, looking at that oak desk, running my hand over the scratches and coffee stains that mapped out our family's history. The desk had seen births announced and death certificates signed. It had held marriage licenses and divorce papers. Today it would host something new. Justice served cold with a side of paperwork. My cousins arrived in separate Mercedes, because of course they did. They walked in like they owned the place, which technically they did for about another 30 minutes. Mark was wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Steve had on one of those watches that could tell you the time in 17 time zones and your net worth in real time. They looked at me with the kind of pity you'd give a dog that doesn't know it's about to be put down. Mark made a show of examining the room, talking about what they'd do with the space. Maybe keep it as a historical exhibit in the resort. Charge people $50 to see how farmers used to live. Steve laughed and suggested they could hire me as a tour guide. Let me tell stories about the good old days. The disrespect was so thick you could spread it on toast. Henderson arrived exactly at noon, carrying a briefcase that probably contained the most expensive documents I'd ever see. He played his part perfectly. Professional, cold, slightly impatient, like he had better places to be. He laid out the papers on the desk with surgical precision. 3 copies of everything. 1 for Big Sky Holdings, 1 for the sellers, 1 for the lawyers. He explained the terms like he was reading a grocery list. Big Sky Holdings would purchase all shares of Miller Family Holdings, LLC, for $7 million. Payment would be placed in escrow immediately upon signing, released once the title cleared. All parties must sign. No exceptions. My cousins were practically vibrating with greed. The signing began with me. Henderson pointed to where I needed to sign for my 25%. I picked up the pen, the same damn pen my cousins had handed me at Dad's funeral, and hesitated just long enough to make them think I was having second thoughts. Mark actually patted my shoulder, told me this was for the best, that I'd thank them someday. The audacity of it made my hand shake, which probably sold the performance even better. I signed. Each signature felt like loading a bullet into a gun. When I finished, I slumped in my chair like a defeated man, which wasn't entirely an act. Part of me was exhausted from carrying this weight, this anger, this plan. Mark and Steve exchanged smirks that they didn't even try to hide. Then it was their turn. Steve signed first, making a show of it, talking about how this was a smart play, how they'd turn failing farm into a $7 million payday. Mark went next, adding that they'd done more for the family legacy in 6 months than our ancestors had in a century. The disrespect to our grandfather, our father, everyone who bled for this land. It took everything I had not to react. When the last signature was done, Henderson collected the papers with the same surgical precision. He placed them in his briefcase, locked it, and then did something that wasn't part of the script we'd rehearsed. He smiled. Not a professional smile, but the kind of smile a cat gets when it realizes the mouse has nowhere left to run. He looked at my cousins and said there was one more formality. The new owner wanted to meet them. Mark asked if he was coming to the farm. Henderson said no, he was already here. That's when I stood up, walked around the desk, and sat in the chair that had belonged to every head of the Miller family for 4 generations. My father's chair, my grandfather's chair, my chair. The confusion on their faces was beautiful. Mark actually laughed, thought it was some kind of joke, asked what I thought I was doing, if I was really that desperate for attention. That's when Henderson delivered the line we'd practiced a dozen times. He said he'd like to introduce them to the sole owner of Big Sky Holdings, Mr. Daniel Miller. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. You could actually see their brains trying to process what just happened. Steve's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Mark's face went from red to white to green like a Christmas light, having a breakdown. Then came the denial. No way. Impossible. Where would I get that kind of money? This had to be fraud, a setup, a scam. They threatened to sue, to call the police, to destroy me in court. Henderson just stood there, calm as a frozen lake, letting them vent like pressure from a steam engine. When they finally ran out of steam, I did the one thing I'd been planning since the moment I found those stones in the ravine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the largest sapphire I'd kept, the one I didn't sell, the one that was worth more than this entire farm. I set it on the desk with a sound like thunder. The facets caught the light from a window, throwing blue fire across the room, across their faces, across the papers they'd just signed. The transformation was instant. They recognized what was immediately. Guys like them always know what expensive things look like. Steve actually reached for it, but I covered it with my hand. That's when the reality hit them. The ravine they'd never bothered to explore. The worthless rocky ground they'd ignored. The family land they'd seen only as dollars and cents. It had been hiding millions in sapphires, and they just sold it all for a fraction of what one stone was worth. Mark tried to grab the contract from Henderson's briefcase. Steve started screaming about duress, about fraud, about family betrayal. The irony of that last one actually made me laugh, which just made the matter. Henderson calmly explained that everything was legal, documented, and irreversible. They'd been under no pressure to sell. They'd named their price and received it. The fact that they didn't know the true value of what they were selling was their own failure of due diligence. He added one more twist to the knife. He told them that in his professional opinion, they were lucky. If word got out about the sapphire before the sale, it could have been tied up in court for decades. Mining rights, mineral surveys, environmental impact studies. They'd have spent millions in legal fees and might have ended up with nothing. This way, they walked away with $7 million free and clear. They should thank Mr. Miller for his generosity. The look on their faces when he said that was worth every penny I'd paid him. They stood there in their expensive suits, with their expensive watches, holding their expensive phones, and realized they'd been outplayed by the farmer boy they dismissed. The country fool had played them like a fiddle at a barn dance. They left without another word. What could they say? They'd gotten exactly what they'd asked for, just not what they'd wanted. As their Mercedes pulled away, throwing gravel like final insults, Henderson shook my hand. He said in 30 years of practice, this was the most satisfying case he'd ever won. He actually refused the final $50,000, said the look on their faces was payment enough, though he did keep one of the smaller sapphires as a memento. That was 3 months ago. The farm is mine again, free and clear. All of it. The fields are green now. The drought finally broken by spring rains that felt like benediction. I've started the organic certification process Dad always talked about but never got around to. The old equipment is repaired or replaced. The bills are paid with enough left over to run for years without worry. But the best part isn't the money or even the land. It's the restoration of something harder to define. Call it justice, call it karma, call it the land itself settling scores. My cousins got their millions, but they lost their legacy. They chose to be rich instead of righteous, and that choice will eat at them forever. Every time they drive past a jewelry store, every time they see a blue stone, they'll remember what they threw away. I kept most of the sapphires, not to sell, but as insurance and as reminder. They're in a safety deposit box now, legal and declared and taxed properly. Funny thing is, I rarely think about them. When you got good soil under your feet and clean rain on your face, $1 million in stones seems less important than next season's seed order. Last week, Miss Emily from the local elementary school stopped by. We talked about setting up an agricultural education program, bringing kids out to see where food actually comes from. She looked at the fields at the house, at that old oak desk visible through the study window, and said something that would have made Old Flint proud. She said the land looked happy. I think she's right. The land remembers who loves it and who betrays it. It keeps score in ways that have nothing to do with deeds or contracts. My cousin saw dirt and dollars. My father saw responsibility and legacy. Old Flint saw mystery and memory. Me, I see all of it. The dirt that grows into dollars, the responsibility that becomes legacy, the mystery that holds memory. That sapphire I show my cousins, I had it cut and polished. It sits on Dad's desk now, right where he used to keep his coffee mug. Sometimes the morning light hits it just right, and it throws blue shadows across the room like pieces of sky fell through the window. It reminds me that the greatest treasures aren't always the ones you sell. Sometimes they're the ones you keep, the ones you fight for, the ones that were under your feet all along. The farm endures. The family name is restored. And somewhere in Denver, two men in expensive suits are learning what every farmer knows. You reap what you sow. They planted betrayal in the soil, and they harvested exactly what they deserved. Money without meaning, wealth without worth. As for me, I planted justice and grew a future. Not bad for a country fool, with dirt under his nails and sky in his pocket.